Welcome. It's nice to have you here. Today is our Relax into Health, Wealth, and Happiness meeting. So you perhaps know the routine. If not, then you can make the most of this meeting by relaxing. And as usual, it's an active process. So be aware. Be aware of what it is that you're doing that is interfering with the relaxation. And that's what I mean by an active process. It's not that you can do the relaxation, it's not active in that sense, but you can be aware of what it is that you're doing that is interfering with the relaxation. And by being aware, then you can allow yourself to begin to stop doing that. Well, I guess I've already, that sort of concludes the meeting because I had in mind a topic for today, which is how to stop suffering. Well, I wasn't sure how to present it actually. Many different ways that it could be presented. It could be either how to stop suffering. I also thought it could be how to feel better. Those are the two that came to mind actually. And I opted last minute to go for how to stop suffering. It's the same material, but we'll go with how to stop suffering. Maybe that it doesn't matter for those who are here live, because for those who are here live, you already know the value, presumably, or you know some of the value. The title of the you know the the topic and all of that is really for the recording that's published on YouTube. And then I think about how does one communicate to people who don't know what it is that they don't know, so that they can receive what they don't even know that they want to receive. So I think about these things. But our topic is how to stop suffering, or AKA how to feel better. And I've already given it away, though. That's it. That's the totality of it. It's active relaxation, to be aware and to notice what you're doing that interferes, and then to stop doing that. But, if that's all that was said, then very few people would get the value of it. So I'll say more about it and give more nuanced and detailed instruction on this. Today will be I will continue to endeavor to keep it simple. I was reminded yet again of the importance of this because I began an experiment of publishing some short posts on this platform called Substack. I had been under the impression, perhaps a good impression, perhaps a mistaken impression, that it would be a place to reach the right kind of people. And then I began the experiment, and I had we'll call it intuitive sense that it would be best to keep the post short rather than long, because as you know, I do these meetings which are fairly long. And I thought it would be a nice contrast to do something that would keep it short. And the idea would be that it would give somebody something to work with to reflect upon, to explore in their actual life, rather than a whole bunch of words that then they could read through and feel that they'd accomplished the task. Because that's really nothing. Just to read the thing or to listen to the thing is, as you probably know, it's like that's very little. Of course, we're taught that we're consumers. It's a consumer culture, apparently, and so we're led to believe that all we need to do is consume. Like that's all you need to do is just consume. But apparently, there's more to it than just consumption. you have to be you have to actually digest it. It's not just to consume, but to actually digest it, to absorb it, to make it your own, to actually discover what it is that is being pointed to. That's where the real that's where the real value is. And so I've published, as of now, 2 short pieces, and the most recent one, I published what apparently was too advanced of a lesson, which is this, and those who are here live, you've heard this before, that everything that happens in your life is good. I won't go into all the details of that here because that's too advanced of a lesson. We have to keep it simple. So I was reminded that it's very important to keep it simple. I thought that was simple, but that's too advanced. There's so many other steps that are required before one can actually get to that point of understanding what that's actually pointing to, because it's such a there are all these nuances. So today I want to look at possibly, hopefully, something much simpler that gives the underpinnings that allow for those more advanced lessons, which then you don't need to receive from me. You receive them from life automatically and directly. So the thing about, okay, so let's take a look at how to stop suffering. So the first thing is to recognize that you are suffering. And you might think that that's really obvious. But then again, you might not. I see. This is the funny thing is, I know it's obvious. I don't mean it's obvious to me that you're suffering, but it's obvious to me when I'm suffering. It's so obvious, and so I think, oh, everybody should recognize how obvious it is. But then it turns out it's not. Most people don't know. So it has to be pointed out. You have to actually recognize that you're suffering. Because if you don't, then you're certainly not going to do anything intelligent about it, right? Because if you, the truth is, and this is something that might be shocking to you, maybe it won't be shocking to you. It really depends on your level of we'll call it awakening, how awake you are to your own experience. But what most people call happiness is actually suffering. I'm not the only one to point this out, of course. This has been pointed out for thousands of years by people probably far more intelligent than me. but it's worth noticing that what most people consider happiness is actually suffering. And so most people are chasing after suffering. They're calling it happiness. And so if a person doesn't recognize that, then they'll continue to do the same thing, thinking they're chasing after happiness and not understanding why it is that they're hurting so much. And then they won't even know to call it what it really is. And so this is the first thing, is just to notice that you're suffering. And I don't mean necessarily that you're suffering all the time, but just to notice when you're suffering, to actually tell the truth about it. And so on the one hand, we don't know that we're suffering because perhaps we're not aware that this is what we're calling happiness, or the pursuit of happiness, is actually suffering. And the other way in which this can happen is that we're too prideful. We say, "Oh no, I'm not suffering," because we think that we're too advanced, we know too much, we don't want to let on to anybody, least of all ourselves, that we might be suffering, that that's even a possibility for us, because we think of ourselves as too advanced, too elevated, to whatever, too, spiritually knowledgeable, whatever. We've studied all the things and we know all the right answers, and so if we're not suffering, it's not suffering, we say. But if you can't acknowledge it, if you can't tell the truth about it, then what are you going to do? You can't do anything intelligent if you want to do the first prerequisite, which is to acknowledge the thing itself. So we have to recognize, first of all, if we want to stop suffering, and surely you do, then you have to recognize that you're suffering first, when you're suffering. Again, I'm not saying you're suffering all the time. Maybe you are, maybe you're not, but you have to recognize it when it's happening and tell the truth about it. Now, one reason I think that people may have this pride that stands in the way of them actually admitting to it is because there is oftentimes, I think, a kind of a sense of futility, a sense that there is no real end to suffering. That suffering, like they'll understand the first of the noble truths, I think they are, of Buddhism, that which I think all it is I think all it is just dukkha. I think is all that is. I think it's just one word, which is understood to be suffering. But then, so I think it's more. I'm not a Buddhist expert, but I think that's the truth, and I think then that the more accurate way to understand that is just simply that suffering is a fact, that there is this phenomenon that is called suffering. But oftentimes it's understood by people as life is suffering. And so then some people will distort that and they'll believe that life is suffering. And so that's just all there is to it, end of story. And so they don't want to admit when they're suffering. But whether that's what the Buddha meant or not, we are free actually to look intelligently at our own experience presently. Not, well, we're free to do whatever we want, I suppose, but we're free to actually be intelligent rather than blindly accepting some interpretation of something that somebody else said. We get to actually look for ourselves. And really, I would say that any authentic teaching or invitation is really just inviting us to look for ourselves. It's kind of what I said at the beginning, that it's not just about what we consume, it's about what we digest and absorb, what we're able to actually make our own, or what actually points us to ourselves. So whatever you believe about any of this, whether you believe life is suffering, or you believe the Buddha meant life is suffering, or you believe whatever you believe you're not suffering, you believe you're beyond suffering, whatever the case may be, the possibility right now is actually just to be willing to just liberate yourself of that and just drop it. Whatever you might believe, whatever you might be holding on to, whatever you might be trying to protect yourself with, whatever you might be trying to do, whatever, anything, you've got all of this stuff that your strategies, much of which you don't normally recognize consciously, but you can in this moment. That's the possibility, is just to notice it. and see that you don't need to hold on to that right now, that you actually are free to let it go and to actually attend to what's actually here as it is. Well, already, I suppose, if you can do just that much, it's already the end of suffering. But let's let's look a little bit more, just in case, because oftentimes that's still not clear enough. So, but at least, if possible, just notice your biases, notice your strategies, notice the beliefs, notice all that stuff as it's here, and just be aware of it, and maybe ask yourself the question, why do I believe that I need to hold on to that so tightly? Why do I believe that I couldn't let it go, at least for a little bit? Just extend that invitation to yourself that for just a little bit, just now, you could let it go. You could just set it down. And maybe you've got all kinds of reasons why you are uncomfortable with that. But if you're unwilling to sincerely explore that, then at the very least, you can recognize in that there's something that you're doing that may very well be contributing to the sense of feeling cramped or overwhelmed or burdened, because you're carrying this thing, you're clinging to it, you're defending yourself, you're the one that's doing that. And so at least you can see that, maybe. And just the seeing, at least, that is, if all you do is see that, it's at least an opening. It's a shining of the light that allows you to recognize something that you didn't see so clearly before, and that opens the possibility of some new choice. But if you can, then if you're willing, then just set all those things aside, put them down for now, and just be willing to engage in this inquiry honestly, sincerely, and openly. So step one to end suffering is to acknowledge the suffering when it's happening. And then step two is, I mean, I'm breaking it down into steps. There may be other steps, so don't think this is the only way, but this seems like an intelligent way. It's a pretty logically sequenced, intelligent way that will work. So second step is to actually be curious about what it actually is. So, and now, boy, this might seem totally obvious, but like so many of these things, we just tend to overlook the obvious. So I've noticed that when I reflect on my own life and when I observe other people's behavior, what I see is that typically people, myself included, historically, seem to overlook this obvious importance of actually recognizing what it really is. Because otherwise, what happens is we just react, but we don't know what it is that's really going on. And so the reaction is not to what's going on or what is, but rather to our own conditioning. So we're just reacting to really to our own past, whether that's our personal past or our ancestral past or our species past, or the past of all life, whatever it is. We're just reacting to that past conditioning. Like if you observe non-human animals, you'll probably see that they don't tend to demonstrate an enormous amount of choice. Like a dog, if it's the dog's nature, some dogs have less of this in them than others, but oftentimes dogs, it's just their conditioning that when they eat, they feel threatened if somebody comes nearby, especially another dog. And so they might growl if somebody comes nearby. You could try to explain to the dog, oh, no, I don't want your kibbles. I don't like kibbles. It's not my thing. There's no real threat here. Don't worry. But the dog doesn't care. It can't understand. It's only reacting. And the truth is, most humans, most of the time, are no different. Well, we think we're different, but most humans, most of the time, are no different, just reacting to their past. And so if we want to change, then we have to be conscious. And if we want to be conscious, then we have to actually notice what's really happening. So always helpful to slow down, particularly if you notice some reaction welling up. I mean, tell the truth about it. You are probably, like me, like most humans, it's not personal. It's just encoded into us that it just comes up, doesn't it? It's just you want to bite that person's head off, don't you? How dare you challenge me? Of course I'm right. I know everything. And how could you dare ask me such a insulting and stupid question? I've seen everything. I know everything. I've accurately judged it all, and I'm superior. And this is just encoded in us. So it's very helpful to slow down, and then you can just observe. Okay, here it comes. Here's the growl. Here's the snap. Here's the whatever it is. Here's the thing that's coming up. Just watch. And then actually in that, there's the ability to see it rather than being seized by it. You see the difference, that you can just actually be witness to it. And then you can see it for what it is. You can see all the crazy stuff that goes on in your own body and mind. All the crazy beliefs, all the crazy reactions. If you just slow it down, you'll see, holy cow, there's an insane asylum in here. Reacting to everything. It's so quick with a reaction. Now, if you take that personally, then that's a rough way to go. But just see, you're not the insane asylum. The insane asylum is just here. It's you inherited it. You took a human body and you got all the stuff that comes along with it. It's not personal. Everybody's doing it. It's just how it is. But most people are asleep to it. They have no clue that that's not them. But you have the ability to slow down and notice it's not you. Isn't that wonderful? I mean, already there's such freedom. So right there, end of suffering. So at every point, it's the end of suffering. If you really can recognize, if you just can tell the truth about that there's suffering happening already, it's the end of suffering. But if that's not enough, for some reason that doesn't quite undo it, then the next step is see it for what it actually is. And we can break that down even more. So the first step of the second step of seeing it for what it is just to slow down and see, okay, here's a bunch of reaction happening real fast, quick judgments, reactions, opinions about everything. I'm laughing because it's really insane. And you can see it too. So when you see that there's this insane asylum and it's not you and you're free because you can see it and you're not bound by it, that right there is the end of suffering. But if that doesn't quite undo it, then we can take another step. So next, we want to see even more clearly what it really is. So maybe we need to slow down even more, because if we didn't quite see it for what it is, if it's still catching, if we're still taking it personally, if we still are uh, grasping onto something there, then just slow it down even more. Just notice how you're doing this reaction still, or it's taking you over and it's compelling you to do it, but you have choice still. You're never without choice. It just requires that you slow down even more, and then you can start to question, okay, what is this really? Because if I can at least take this step, and I can step one and acknowledge, okay, I'm suffering, this starts to interrupt it. And then I can see more about what it really is. It's just this reaction, this impersonal reaction that's coming from my past, from my personal past, my familial past, whatever. But there it is. It's just this way of reacting. Then I'm starting to see it more clearly, but if I slow it down even more, I can start to see even more clearly, because up to this point, maybe it still seems like it's a monolith, this thing called suffering. And oh, here it is, suffering. Oh no. Maybe we can maybe we label it a little bit so it's not quite just global suffering, but it's a particular form of suffering. We say, oh, here it is, the rage, or here it is, the depression, or here it is, the anxiety, or here it is, the insecurity, or whatever it is. I mean, maybe you're in the habit of funneling it into this category of it's all entirely physical. It's here it is again, this physical thing. So maybe we filter it and narrow it a little bit in that way, but we still haven't actually seen what is it really, because as I've often pointed out, all that we're all that's happening in our lives is our own experience. So you never encounter anything outside of your own experience. It's never something outside of your experience, no matter what it is. The other person hits you, the other person insults you, the other person steals from you, the weather occurs, whatever it is, the accident occurs, whatever the thing happens, your only knowledge of it and the only way that you can encounter it is through your own experience. So it's always, and this is good news, it's always only your experience. When you're blaming something else or somebody else, then you're pretending to be a victim, which robs you momentarily, at least, of the ability to do something different, to choose peace, to end the suffering. As long as you're blaming something or someone else, then you have no ability to end the suffering. So you can recognize that I said this was going to be very simple. I hope it's simple. I guess it's somewhat advanced. Sorry about that. I'm trying to keep it simple. But when it comes to something important, I guess you can't keep it overly simple. It has to be, try to keep it as simple as possible, but no simpler than is necessary. So I'm going to give you what's necessary. Okay. So we can hopefully though, you can see that. I know for those who are here live, I've gone over this so many times, you probably hopefully have recognized what I'm pointing to, and you've really explored this in your own life and seen the truth of it. That it's only your own experience. There's nothing else happening for you. That's it. And this is such good news because it's entirely within your ability to choose. So we can recognize that, we can see that whatever the story is about it, the real truth is that whatever I seem to be having a problem with, that's my experience. It's happening in my experience exclusively. It's not outside of my experience. Now, this, just to be clear, that doesn't mean it would never be appropriate to try and interface and negotiate something with somebody else. I mean, if you have an ongoing relationship with somebody and it's important to you, and they they're there's some sort of behavior that the other person is engaging in that you don't like, that is, injurious to you, it would probably be appropriate for you to express that to them and negotiate with them and try and figure that out. But what I am saying is that that person is never the problem. The suffering is never their fault. They may be doing something injurious. I'm not going to deny that, but the your experience is all that you have, and that's what you have to work with. So you can look then and start to see, be curious about, okay, this suffering that I'm experiencing, that I've already admitted to, is happening in my experience. What is it actually? If it's happening in my experience, I want to know, what is it? What is the thing? Because as I've already said, it's not actually, there's no such thing as suffering, actually. So it's a bit of a tricky thing. First, we have to admit to it, but then once we've admitted to it, which is just the entry point, then we need to actually see that this suffering as a thing doesn't exist. What does exist is my experience, and my experience has constituent parts that when I look carefully, I can actually see what they are. And that gives me something that I can actually work with meaningfully. Because if I say I'm suffering and I leave it at that, then what on earth can I do? Oh, woe is me. The suffering is upon me. You see that, or sometimes people will understand, or at least be willing to accept the possibility that the suffering is something in their own experience, but then they don't know what to do with that because they're looking for the suffering. Where is it? I so badly want to be able to do something positive and constructive, helpful for myself in regard to the suffering. I'll do whatever it takes, but where is it? I can't find it. So we have to then acknowledge that there is no such thing, but there is a phenomenon that's occurring, but this label of suffering, or whatever label we put on it, we can call it anger, resentment, pain, whatever the case may be, we want to see that that thing does not exist as an object. There's no thing there. There's no thing called pain. There's no thing called anger. No, it doesn't exist. But I am subjectively experiencing some phenomenon that I, as a shorthand, apply that label to. So it's for communication purposes, so that we can maybe be helpful to one another, right? If you have somebody who you love and care about, and they're hurting, you want to be able to communicate, so you use words that point to it. But as I've already said many times here, it's ultimately it's a subjective phenomenon. So you look to see, okay, well, what is the actual nature of this subjective phenomenon that I've been calling fill in the blank, right? Whatever you call it suffering, you call it pain, you call it anger, you call it anxiety, whatever you call it. What is it actually subjectively? So now we start to break it down even more, so we're really slowing down, because the normal pace is so fast that you gloss over all of it. It's like it's after there's been no rain for a while, it's and then there's some initial rain. It's the most dangerous time for driving on asphalt because it creates these like oil slicks. So it makes it there's a they call it hydroplaning is the term hydroplaning. And so hit the brakes, but the tire, the rubber won't actually connect to the surface that you're driving on because there's this little oil slick in between. So it's hydroplaning. It's just gliding right over. So when we're moving fast in our lives, which is what most of our lives are all about, it's just so fast, it's automatic, and there's some value in that at a certain level, but it's dangerous because then we're going to hydroplane. And so you're just reacting and you don't even know what you're reacting to. You call it something, but you don't know what the thing actually is. You never really take a look. So the opportunity is to really take a look. So step one, you have to acknowledge that you're suffering in the moment, because if you don't acknowledge that, you're not going to slow down and take a look. Otherwise, you say, no, it's all great. It's fine. I'm fine. It's all their fault. You have to actually be willing to admit, I'm suffering. I'm in pain. I'm hurting. And I don't like it. And I'm so tired of it. And I want to do something intelligent and different. So then, great. Now you can slow down. You slow down. Then you take a look and you see, okay, so let me actually see what this experience is. You notice, well, it's a subjective experience. And then you can see, what is it really? So this won't come as a big surprise, I don't think, to anybody who's here live and anybody who's listened to any of these recordings. But take a look for yourself and see what do you find is there. And what I will propose to you is there. We can maybe we could maybe break it up in different ways. I'll propose at least one and maybe several ways, but start with one way. So look and see that you have, if you're suffering in any fashion, again, whether that's you consider it to be physical suffering or mental suffering or emotional suffering or whatever kind of suffering you consider it to be, see that it will imagine for a moment that you had no feeling. There's no feeling. You're just totally neutral, entirely neutral about the whole thing. No feeling at all. You might have the same thoughts, the same so-called objective scenario is still occurring, but you had no feeling at all about it. Is there a possibility of suffering then? Hopefully you can see, no, there's no possibility of suffering because the suffering depends upon the feeling. If there's no feeling, there's no suffering. So one significant component of suffering is feeling. Now, before we blame feeling and say, aha, feeling's the culprit, feeling is suffering, which is not what I'm saying. Let's also take a look at, and let's say, okay, imagine that you have that feeling, the feeling that you would otherwise call the physical pain, mental anguish, emotional turmoil, whatever it is, that feeling is there. But you have no thoughts or beliefs about it whatsoever. Is there suffering? And hopefully you can see, no, there's no suffering. So at a minimum, we have thoughts and feelings, which are both necessary for suffering. So at a minimum, we could say that suffering, which I've already hopefully clearly stated, there is no actual thing there. There's no thing called suffering. It's not an object that you can grab hold of and say, here it is, I'm going to banish it forever. There's a subjective phenomenon, and that we use the shorthand of a label for, but actually the subjective phenomenon consists of constituent parts, and at a minimum, it involves feelings and thoughts. Now, out of habit, there's a particular association, because clearly not all feelings are problematic, and not all thoughts are problematic. It's particular combinations of thoughts and feelings that are problematic. So actually, the thoughts and the feelings independently, they're completely neutral. It's just when they go together, in particular, combine in particular ways, and there's a habit, that there is whatever we would call suffering. So when we slow down enough, we can see, now there's usually an impulse still to gotta react, say, wait a second, this is stupid, this can't be, there's got to be some other explanation for it. It can't be that simple. You can churn around all you want with it, but if you find something different, please let me know. But I have looked at this quite a lot, and this is what I have found. That there are thoughts and feelings that, when combined and sped up in particular ways, this is what results in the phenomenon of suffering in its various forms. Now, this is really good news, because this means that we actually can intervene. We have a possibility of doing something. Okay, so I'll just also throw in now one of my other favorite terms, which is vicious cycle. So notice that, because there are other components to this. So there's the thought and the feeling. So there might be a feeling of tension and a thought that says this shouldn't be. I mean, kind of, if we were to bring it down to its bare bones form, it kind of comes down to that. There's some feeling of tension, and there's a thought that says this should not be. It might be many variations on that theme, but it kind of comes down to that. So we've got this thought and this feeling, this tension, and this thought that says this shouldn't be, and they start to spin around, feed into one another. The feeling is there, and then the thought says this shouldn't be, and then the feeling tends to intensify, and then the thought says this really shouldn't be, and then the feeling intensifies even more, and then the thought says this really, really, really shouldn't be. And then there's other things that are also, we can start to see, are also part of this, because they're feeding into this vicious cycle. So memories and fantasies, right? They start to be drawn in, all the evidence about, oh, these are the things that have happened in the past that demonstrate that this is a really bad thing. There's that time when that thing happened and it worked out badly, and this must be just like that. Remember, I said we're just reliving, or we're just experiencing our own past conditioning. So it just comes up so fast, vicious cycle. So you can see that there's a tendency, because there's a momentum, there's a habit, that this just happens. It pops up and then it spins. And if we aren't very determined to slow down and choose differently, then that momentum will just feed into the vicious cycle. And the next thing we know, we'll be unconsciously hurting ourselves, blaming it on everybody else. blaming it on life, blaming it on God, blaming it on the weather, blaming it on whoever and whatever we can. But we always have this possibility. Now, slow it down. First of all, admit I'm suffering. Next, take a look and see what is the actual subjective experience. Notice their thoughts, feelings, memories, fantasies. And it has a tendency to spin into a vicious cycle. Just seeing that is the end of suffering. But maybe that doesn't seem like enough. Maybe that doesn't seem adequate to actually end the suffering. Or what I should say is, if that's seen and seen all the way and not abandoned, then it really that really truly is the end of suffering. Suffering cannot stand in the face of that, because notice what has just been presented, that you become conscious and you slow down to actually become conscious enough to see what's really happening, instead of hydroplaning, instead of just going into this unconscious reaction and thinking that you're conscious when you're completely asleep. Instead of that, you slow down and you see what's really happening. That has stopped the vicious cycle. The vicious cycle cannot happen when in the face of that. There's no possibility of it. Now, there may be, because there's such a habit, there's a tendency to abandon that, because the thought will come up and say, this isn't working. I don't feel good yet. I'm still suffering, it says. So it's just been abandoned prematurely, if that's accepted to be true. So this is an important nuance, because this is, we've been trained to expect instant gratification, which is another word for addiction, which is another word for unconscious, which is another word for vicious cycles, which is another word for suffering. We've been trained. We've been trained to suffer. Remember what I said. Most people think that what they call happiness is actually suffering. They have no idea. They think that they're chasing after happiness. They're really just suffering, because that's what we've been trained to do. We've been trained to suffer. You wouldn't suffer otherwise. You've been trained to do it. And by and large, the culture glorifies it. And so it takes, I think it takes an enormous amount of sanity and courage to actually be willing to stop the suffering. It's not so easy, actually. I mean, it's remarkably easy, and it's not easy at the same time. It's remarkably easy because you can see what it actually consists of. It just means you have to be conscious. Just tell the truth about what it is that's actually happening. See it for what it is. That stops it. But this is completely flying in the face of what the broader culture is doing. I mean, it's somewhat shocking to recognize, but if you start to open your eyes to it, you'll see by and large, the entire culture is going over a cliff, and they're calling it a fun amusement ride, or they're calling it virtue, or they're calling it all kinds of things. They're calling it fun, happiness, peace, and it's the antithesis. So it takes a lot of courage to actually be willing to tell the truth and see that the emperor has no clothes, and that you're you if you just follow the crowd, you'll go off the cliff, and that you are 100% responsible for your experience. And if you want to end suffering, then you need to tell the truth about it, and you need to be willing to actually see what's really going on. And then you need to be willing to stay with it, keep telling the truth about it, because there's so much friction then. That friction is then easy to mistake for a continuation of suffering. So it takes a little while to properly reorient yourself, because you're accustomed to going in this particular way with the momentum of the vicious cycle, being told that this is good, desirable, that you're fighting for something, that you're getting somewhere. And to actually stop and see what really is so radical that it it there's an enormous amount of friction that's generated, and that friction again can be mistaken for something problematic. And so it just takes a willingness to allow and stay with telling the truth and seeing what really is. And then it begins this process of reorientation, and it actually begins to reverse the vicious cycle and turn it into a virtuous cycle, instead of being compelled by the momentum of the old unconscious reactions. You can actually see what is, and you can choose from that sanity. So that you can actually, it's the craziest thing. I mean, it really is. It's just really wild to see how inverted things are in our perception, and that it all clears up just by slowing down to the point of stopping, but not stopping by slamming on the brakes. It's not that kind of thing. It's not a violent reaction. It's just to stop doing the thing that feeds into the vicious cycle, and bit by bit it unwinds. It stops on its own because you're no longer feeding into it. And that's the end of suffering. Now, that doesn't sound, I guess, just to say the end of suffering, it doesn't sound so great. It's not like it's not as it doesn't maybe sound as attractive as uh, enlightenment, or uh, perfect inner peace, or whatever people want or think they want. But it actually is what you truly want. Because as I've often pointed out, what you really want is who you are, and you don't have to do something to be who you are. You already are who you are. So that's already a given, but it's overshadowed by all of the doing, the vicious cycle of suffering. And so in this process of slowing down, being aware, seeing what's happening, seeing what it really is, just noticing that it's just, oh look, it's just, here's this tension, and here are these thoughts, and all of these memories and fantasies are just getting dragged into this vicious cycle that just churns round and round, heading off the cliff, compelling more and more reaction, which just really feeds into it. When you just see that, then you start to notice, boy, that's miserable. And when you see that it's miserable, you stop doing it. And as I've said, when you stop doing it, there's this friction that's generated that you'll probably mistake for more suffering. That it's this paradox where, for example, with somatic inquiries using, obviously I'm an enthusiast of Thomas Hanna's work, so using as an example Thomas Hanna's style of explorations, use pandiculations to make conscious those patterns in the nervous system that were previously unconscious, then what actually can come up in the short term is discomfort, headaches, pain, aches, strain, all kinds of things can come up. You say, "Oh, this is the opposite of what I thought I was going for." I thought I was trying to get myself out of pain, and now I'm experiencing pain. How could this be? But it's a reorientation in the nervous system. And so the nervous system just is suddenly becoming aware of all of this stuff, and it's just, whoa, freak out. And it doesn't know what to do. So it just says, oh, must be pain, must be a headache, must be anger, must be irritation, must be insomnia. And it just can produce all of these subjective experiences because it says, well, I don't know what else it is. It must be these things. But being willing to just continue to engage in the process of being aware, conscious, slowing down, telling the truth about it, seeing it for what it is, it continues to unwind. The friction thereby eases up. And then there's the underlying clarity and truth of who you already are that's revealed. And in that, there's a revelation. You don't need to do anything or have anything as a condition for the fulfillment of who you already are. So that's what I have to say today. I hope that that was sufficiently simple and clear, and that you understood it as empowering and valuable, and that you can actually put that into practice in your life. There's so many nuances to these things, even though it's so simple. You know that. I mean, those of you who are alive, you know that. Maybe I'm speaking at this point mostly to anybody who's watching this on YouTube, the recording. Just trust and know that what's being pointed to here is true. Don't grasp it and turn it into something that is a static understanding that you say, now I've got it, and this is my dogma that I'm going to hold on to forever and ever is my salvation, because that misses the point. Rather, it's a living inquiry, and the living inquiry is what returns you to real life. So let it be a living inquiry. Let it be something that continually, moment to moment, helps you to awaken to yourself, to life, to the truth of what's really happening, instead of the habits of reactivity and unconsciousness that are the norm. So it's a process. It's a process. Rather than trying to arrive at some end, see the possibility of the joy of engaging in a process that continually awakens you to the depths of aliveness it's possible. So that's it for today. Thank you very much. And for those who are here live, I'm happy to stay on for Q&A in the event that you have anything. So let me end this recording